Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to actually the 14th in our series of Mass General Answering the Call. And the subject for today's is self-care for the mind and body. I'd like to remind all of you that have been on our calls before, and then all of you who are new to the call, that no microphones or video capabilities are actually needed to participate. And at any point during this webinar, you're able to ask questions, and you can do it anonymously if you prefer. And you can do it through the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we'll endeavor to answer just as many questions as possible. The webinar will be recorded, and we'll send out a shareable link after the call. We've learned as we've gone along in terms of what makes these calls the most valuable. And so what you'll be doing is you'll be hearing from our panelists very briefly about their areas of expertise and interest. I'll then follow up with several questions for each of them, which will last maybe about 15 minutes. And then the last 15 or 20 minutes of the program, we really invite you to submit your questions. And again, we'll try to get to these as many as possible. Just starting out, joining us for today's panel, we have Dr. John Denninger. And Dr. Denninger will be joining us in his capacity as the Director of Research and Clinical Training at the Benson-Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine. Alongside John is Dr. Ann K. Fishel, who is the Director of the Family and Couples Therapy Program here at Mass General. And Dr. Fishel is also the Director and co-founder of the Family Dinner Project. Joining us today in his role as Senior Director of Health and Wellness for the Home Base Program for Veteran and Military Family Care is Dr. Ron Hirschberg. And finally, our panel is rounded out by Dr. Colleen K. Snydeman, who joins us as the Executive Director of Patient Care Services Office of Quality, Safety, and Practice. And so, John, I'm going to turn things over to you to begin.
Great, thanks so much, Britt. And thanks everyone for coming today. So I just wanted to say a couple of things about the Benson-Henry Institute and my role. The Benson-Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine has really 3 missions, and those missions are pretty simple. We want to use techniques for dealing with stress and for becoming more resilient to help patients and to help other groups, diverse as students and first responders and our fellow healthcare providers. Our second mission is teaching others in Boston, around the state, around the country, and literally around the world to deliver those kinds of interventions to others. And the intervention I'm talking about primarily are mind-body interventions, things that are based on practices like meditation and yoga, and incorporate a lot of other kinds of techniques as well, all combined in our stress management and resiliency training program. And then finally, I'm the Director of Research. I'm a psychiatrist and a biochemist, and I'm especially interested in the science of all this. And so the other mission for the Benson-Henry Institute is grounding all this work in science, trying to understand how practices like meditation, how mind-body practices more broadly, how the SMART program can help reduce stress and increase resilience in people in a way that's important for illness, stress-related illnesses, and emotional illnesses as well. Bottom line, we're here to integrate mind-body medicine into the general hospital and into medicine more broadly here and around the world. And I'm just going to pass it over to Ann now.
Thanks, John, and lovely to be here with all of you. I'm honored to be here as a family therapist. I wear 2 hats at Mass General, heading up the Family and Couples Therapy Program and the Family Dinner Project. Both programs have been on overdrive during the pandemic, helping stressed and worried families. Through the Family and Couples program, we're seeing more families in therapy than ever before. The pandemic has highlighted the existing strengths and the fault lines in families. We've seen more violence, lots of separations and marriages, fathers more involved with their kids, mothers feeling overburdened, children reeling from losses to their lives and routines, and a 50% increase in shared meal times, which brings me to my other hat, the Family Dinner Project. About a dozen years ago, I became aware of the power of family dinner to bring benefits to bodies, brains, and mental health of kids and adults. Decades of studies have shown that family dinners are associated with lower rates of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, substance abuse, and behavioral problems. The research is so impressive that I'm only half joking when I tell you that as a family therapist, I could almost be out of business if more families had regular family dinners. The science explains why family dinner is so important, and the Family Dinner Project helps family with how to make it easier, more frequent, more doable, and more fun. Our website, thefamilydinnerproject.org, has hundreds of free resources, recipes, games, conversation starters, tips, stories. And we work with community groups. We run parent workshops. We host community dinners at military bases, clinics, libraries, homeless shelters. And we train educators and mental health professionals to run these programs at their institutions. I like to be involved in prevention when I can and treatment as well of families. Thank you. And now I'll turn the program over to Ron.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks everybody for being here, and Britt and company for inviting me. I'm a physical medicine and rehabilitation physician. The other word for PM&R doc is a physiatrist. When I talk with patients about what we do, many people have an internist. When we work with musculoskeletal injuries and other injuries that may affect our quality of life, we say we're externists as well. PM&R really focuses on quality of life. We say that a cardiologist is a heart doctor, we're function doctors. And really it's about the mental, physical, and spiritual connection that make us who we are and what we bring to the plate for various illnesses or injuries. And so my role in the hospital at Mass General is I'm a consultant in neurotrauma, brain injury, spinal cord injury, stroke, other sort of immediate life changes that people go through. And we work with people acutely in the hospital in the intensive care unit and other units to really begin that process of reintegration as they go to the next step towards getting home. My other hat, and as Anne says, a lot of us have a couple hats, is at home base. I'm the director of health and wellness for the last year. It's been a real privilege to work with a veteran and military population. We focus on brain injury and post-traumatic stress, treated almost 25,000 veterans and families over the last 10 years or so. We focus on yoga, nutrition, fitness, the arts, including visual arts, music therapy, and how we can harness to each individual's expertise, in each individual's likes and dislikes, how we really will connect with their own wellness. So it's really great to be here. Thank you. And Colleen, next.
Thank you, Ron. And again, thank you everyone for listening in, and thank you to Britt and team, because this is such an important topic, especially right now. I've been a nurse at Mass General for over 40 years, but my entry into more of a resiliency well-being situation began back in 2020 as we were preparing for COVID to hit Mass General in Massachusetts. And during that time, our chief nurse, Debbie Burke, asked if I would help facilitate our resiliency and well-being work for our staff, as we really didn't know what was coming. I'd love to read you a quote from one of our nurses who spoke to us after the first surge. She was a general care nurse who went to the ICU, was assigned to go there to help and had never worked there before. She said, I arrived in the ICU and I was so afraid that I had my first panic attack ever. After a while, I settled down. A few months later, after I'd gotten used to the environment and the team, I decided to transfer to the ICU. And she's now an ICU nurse and she's been there for over 1.5 years. Another physical therapist from our department was on the proning team, the teams that I actually launched for COVID, our response to COVID. And his response was on the elevator, on my way to see my first patient, I could hear the beat of my heart in my ears. My hands were shaking and I knew I was going to get COVID. I was so scared. This is what we really tried to address during this time at the beginning. We tried to preemptively help staff. And then once COVID really hit in the thick of it during March, April, May, into June, staff were so stressed they couldn't even talk. We had to wait until the summer where we started to have sessions. We conducted over 200 sessions with our staff, learning from these focus groups, themes that emerged that helped us to then focus on the second surge that came later on towards the end of 2020. And fast forward to today, where we still continue to hear from our staff, despite the waning of COVID, that the stressors are still there and the staff are still in need of resiliency and well-being initiatives. And so I'm thrilled to be able to tell you more about that today. Thank you.
Well, again, thank
Back to, oh, and back, I'm sorry, and back over to Britt.
you. Thanks, Colleen, and thanks to all of our speakers again, today. But before I launch into sort of the initial questions, before we get to the general question and answer, Colleen, when you were talking about the physical therapist and you talked about the quote proning team, our audience may not be familiar with just what that was and really how dramatic and in some ways stressful it was for our staff. So could you spend a little bit of time just talking about that? Yeah.
Sure, of course, thank you. As people may have heard in the news, it became well known to us from China and from Italy as the surges were occurring ahead of us, that the patients were benefiting from being turned on their stomachs. That's called proning patients. And so as we had heard that, knowing how many patients we could potentially have at Mass General, we decided that it would be really beneficial for staff to help launch proning teams who could go to the bedside. They were trained, there were 5 of them per team to help with turning the patients because it's such a major event and it's so difficult when a patient is on a ventilator and has a lot of central lines, arterial lines, tubes and drains, et cetera. And so during the first surge of COVID, we actually had 5 proning teams that were very busy for those 4 months.
Great. Yeah, and it was so counter to something we'd ever done before. It was actually
Yes.
fairly stressful. It was, so anyway.
All right.
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. So let me just start out. I'm going to pose a couple of questions to each one of our panelists, again, before we open it up to the general Q&A for the audience. And John, I'm going to start with you. And for most days, it can feel like we have very little or even no time at all, for ourselves. And I'd like to hear from you. What are a few things we can all do for ourselves every day to help reduce stress and anxiety while increasing our resilience?
That's a great question, Brett. And the first thing I want to say is we all get stressed and we all have this feeling that if we just spend a little more time doing the things that we need to do and, sleep and exercise and other things can go by the wayside, that will win us something in the long term. And that's probably a strategy that's doomed to failure. that these little bits of time that you spend caring for yourself make you more effective, make you better for the people around you, whether it's colleagues at work or your family or what have you. And so I'll just say a couple of very quick things. There are a ton of things, a ton of strategies that we, the Benson-Henry Institute, have. I'm just going to give you two. One is sort of very apropos for upcoming Thanksgiving holiday, and that's gratitude, appreciation, whatever you want to call it. Very simply, if you, at the end of the day, each day, write down like 1 to 3 things that you're grateful for that day, 1 to 3 things that you appreciate. They can be small things like my coffee was delicious this morning, or they can be bigger things like I got to see my sister for the first time in a year or something like that. Whatever they are, really spending a moment to feel that gratitude is can help boost the effect. And even more, you can boost the effect by sharing that with someone you care about. The other thing is what we call mini relaxations. This is a short version of meditation and other longer practices. And it can be as simple as literally 1, 2, 3, 10 breaths. Just pausing for a moment, maybe closing your eyes if you're comfortable doing it, and allowing the breath to just go at its own rhythm, and just paying attention to the in-breath and the out-breath, and seeing how that calms your body down and helps carry that feeling with you through the rest of the day.
So John, just in follow-up to that, one of the things I've appreciated about being at the MGH is that regardless of our 4-part mission, which is patient care, research, education, and commitment to the community, the one thing that really binds us all together is taking care of that next patient that crosses the threshold. And so we firmly believe that patients don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. But the second thing is we are an institution that's guided by science. And so what kind of evidence is there that the kinds of practices you've mentioned can make a real difference in one's health?
That's a very good question, Britt. I mean, the Benson-Henry Institute, I mean, we're dealing with practices, some of which are literally thousands of years old. And obviously they've been important to people for a long, long time, and people have known that they were helpful, but we haven't always have known why. And I could literally spend 3 hours talking about some of this stuff, and I won't burden the audience by doing that. But some of the most exciting stuff that we at Mass General, at the Benson-Henry Institute, and colleagues around the country and around the world have done is showing how practices like the stuff I was just talking about, like gratitude, relaxation practices, meditation practices, yoga, etc. The things that those can do, one of the things those can do, in addition to making changes in the brain that colleagues of ours like Sarah Lazar here at Mass General have talked about and worked on for a long time, are things like showing that those kinds of practices can actually change how genes are turned on and off. And I don't want to get too much into biological details, but just suffice it to say that there are good reasons now that through that kind of work being done, that demonstrates why practices like relaxation and meditation, et cetera, can actually have dramatic effects on illnesses as diverse as cardiovascular disease and psychiatric diseases like depression, for example. It really is quite dramatic.
Thanks so much. That's very helpful. Anne, as a parent and a grandparent, I'm certainly exposed to picky eaters in the house. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some ways to still reap the benefits of a family meal when you're surrounded by picky eaters?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something I get asked a lot, not just about children, but about partners. And I was just thinking about what you were saying, John, about ancient practices. There's probably no more ancient practice than sharing mealtime with others. But as far as picky eaters, I think the first thing I'd say is that food is what brings everybody to the table, but it's really the least important part of a family meal. The benefits to the brain and to academic success, to mental health, those really come from the atmosphere around the table. And so, one of the things that I suggest to parents is to focus less on the food and cajoling and bribing and promising and rewarding kids. If they eat more of their peas, they can have dessert. To do less of that and to focus more on creating an enjoyable fun, interesting time around the table. You know, the atmosphere should be warm and welcoming. It should be a time to bond, to connect, to relax, to have a few laughs. And the food is really secondary. Now, that said, it's, you know, easy to say that until you have a picky eater and you've gone to a lot of trouble to make a delicious meal and people don't want to eat it. So what can you do then? Well, I think you can remind yourself that 20% of toddlers are picky eaters, and most of them will outgrow it. It's really great to start when kids are young, under the age of 3. They're much more open to trying a lot of new foods, and the window tends to close from about 3 to 8. Kids like what's familiar, so parents shouldn't give up presenting the same food over and over again. Eventually kids will say, oh, some kids will say, well, I've seen that food before. I guess it's a familiar one. It can't hurt too much. Some parents bring favorite dips and sauces so that kids can dip new foods into familiar sauces. Sometimes changing the texture. Kids are very sensitive to slimy textures. So sometimes roasting things so they're nice and crispy can also help.
Well, that explains why I didn't like Brussels sprouts as a kid. So it's you know, I think I've certainly been exposed to dinner table conversations with the kids. When asking them, how was your day, it was always greeted with okay. So
Yes.
I'd love to hear your ideas about some creative ways to ask a spouse, and that usually refers to the male member, or a child, how their day was, to avoid everyday conversation turning into the same at family meals. So
Yes, it really does get tedious, and it got more tedious during the pandemic because we were all together. So we knew the answer to that question, how was your day, even before we asked it.
Right.
I think one thing is to keep track in your own mind of little stories that happened during the day so that you can offer a story before you demand something of people in your family. I think sometimes playing games at the table that lead to conversation. So let's go around the table and each person say a rose, a thorn, and a bud that happened today. A rose is something funny or positive, a thorn is something difficult, and a bud is something we hope will happen tomorrow. Or I'm going to tell 2 truths and a lie about my day, and you have to guess which I'm making up. Or some families will watch a movie during dinner and stop and start it, and this will be the source of a lot of conversation. Or one other idea is to have a jar in the middle of your table, and you can download hundreds of conversation starters from our website or make up your own, put them in little slips, stuff them in the jar, and you pull them out as needed. What's your earliest memory? What's your superpower, and how do you use it to help people? What character in a book would you wish you could be friends with? So sort of unusual, whimsical conversation starters that can get things going in a different direction.
great, thanks. So Ron, I'm going to turn to you. As the Senior Director of Health and Wellness for Home Base, why do you think it's so important to integrate wellness into mental health care?
Yeah, thanks, Britt. You know, it's I think of wellness as it's a nebulous term. It's really, you know, what makes us tick individually, whether we are people that are very physical, or whether we are conversational, artistic. So it's an individualized concept, and it's so important to mental health because it makes us feel better this is about self-care. So when we think about veterans and military families, veterans and civilians really have one thing in common. We're all human at the end of the day. And I think that what's specific about the veteran and military population is that there's a real culture of the cohort of folks that have been together, served together, and feel a bond when they are together. We know that there's studies showing certain neurochemicals that are even released when people are together and feel better with each other. There's scientific basis for this. But one of the things about wellness is that we call it the sort of the lower barrier of entry to mental health. What does that mean? It's someone may, with stigma in mental health, as we know, is a big issue. It's been for years. It may be getting better, but as people like John and Ann and others know, that this is something that we all battle. And so stigma can be decreased when you have people that maybe identify with each other in the gym or around the table, as Ann was saying, breaking bread together, having the conversation started that is in a very sort of a very comfortable way outside the office, so to speak, or outside the mental health office. So there's a lot of different ways at home base that we work with veterans and military families and mental health that are non-pharmacologic, and one thing that we're very proud of is art therapy and music therapy. I just say briefly is that it's another way that sort of opens a door into people's narrative and their story. And it's a way to describe it with a therapist with you. So that's one specific area that we're working on a lot. I will say, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to, so when you're describing these programs, do you offer them both to veterans and to their families, or just to the veterans?
It is both. One thing that so the program at home base has a signature element. It's a 2-week program called the Intensive Clinical Program in the ICP, and veterans are brought in all over the country, locally and across the country for no cost, and the family members actually come in midway, and they're a very strong part of the support system, of course, spouses and family. We also have outpatient treatment for spouses and kids as well. And I will say that there's another very specific program that has been is newer, called TAPS. This is Tragedy Assistance Program. And this is specifically for spouses that have lost their loved one to suicide. And they come in as the family member that is served indirectly, of course. So yes, treatment for the whole family, children as well.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Ron. So, Colleen, in your role, sort of handling sort of resilience for the nurses, could you give us some detail about what strategies were put into place to try to support nurses and other members of the healthcare team by restructuring the work or the teams or the systems? And if you'd be willing to be open enough to say not only what's worked, but what did you learn from experience that did not work? Yeah.
Thank you, Britt. Yes, like in the beginning, there were a few things we did right away. We had already been working on trying to get a peer support group up and running across the inpatient units. And so we accelerated that program so we could have many peer supporters out there supporting each other as best we could at the unit level at the bedside. In addition to that, we wanted to make people aware of some of the things that you've already heard about today, like meditation. There's some really great apps online. Employee assistance was very much involved. We pulled an interdisciplinary team together of social workers, chaplaincy, and employee assistance representatives, and then nurse leaders who went out and met with staff in groups. We did, as I'd said earlier, well over 200 of those groups. And later we're able to then generate themes from the groups on lessons learned, things that had happened during the first surge that gave us opportunity to improve how we would do the second time around. In addition, we promoted something called the Going Home Checklist. And later on, we were able to get that on a badge tag for people, really trying to promote the notion and giving people the permission to, when you leave here, try to leave your stresses, work stressors here, and let it go, and try to get home and regroup. But the things that we learned the most were that the teams, the unit-based teams, need to stay intact. The disruption of teams was really, really difficult on our staff. They needed better, more succinct communication. They needed to have a voice. And so thus we put staff nurses on committees so that they could generate the improvement work that we would be doing going forward. And they continued to identify well-being as an area that they really needed support and focus on. And so later, the work continued around organizing things on an Apollo site. Apollo is our Mass General, our new website where we have all kinds of information. And so we focused a lot of the patient care services information all in one place for easy access. And I think altogether, giving staff a voice, promoting the well-being, and the going home aspects of building your resiliency and getting into a better place to be able to come back to be at your best has been really helpful.
Thanks so much, Colleen. So I'm going to transition now over to the questions that have been coming in from the audience. And this is, I'm sure you've had this question that's come in before. And it's, as we say, it's a hardy evergreen question. And this one, it says, Dr. Fishel, as we know, cutting down screen time can improve quality family time. Do you have any tips for reducing screen time that are palatable to both adults and to children? So, and I think you're on mute. Okay.
Sorry about that. That is an evergreen, but I think COVID has also complicated our relationships to screen time. It's really blurred the boundaries even more between school and home and work and home. I think a lot of families are really rethinking what their relationship is going to be with technology going forward. And I see families handling this very differently at the dinner table. Some have a no tolerance rule, check your gadgets before you come to the kitchen and don't look at it. And if you do dare to look at it, you'll have to do the dishes. That's like the most hard line. And some families take a more relaxed view. As long as gadgets are used to help us connect with one another, sharing a funny picture that you took or an email that you didn't mean to send, but you did, and now you want some help from your family about what to do with the fallout. Or playing selfie hot potato, passing the phone around and letting the timer go off and taking a photo and continuing to pass it around. So there's a little group of photos from that dinner. There's some families who, in very creative ways, use technology to enhance connection. But for those who don't, I think the most practical thing to do is to give your kids and your adults in the family a 5-minute heads up. Turn off your screens in 5 minutes because we're going to be all gathering around the table. I think, we often need a little transition time from the virtual world to the real world.
Well, thanks. John, this one I'm going to send to you. Actually, John, one of your colleagues several years ago asked the rhetorical question. He said, why are families so good at pushing your buttons? And the answer was because they're the ones who installed them. Well, so what are some ways we can all focus on our mental health and wellness as we head into the holidays, knowing that family interactions are one of the things that can prove to be a significant stressor? So,
yeah. Yeah, that to say the least, right? I mean, that's been one of the big struggles during the pandemic, right? When people were all sort of forced together in an unusual way, togetherness that is sometimes welcome and sometimes very hard, because people do know which buttons to push in one's family. I actually think, I can talk a little bit more about one of my favorite things, which is meditation. I think meditation is a great way to get us in a better place for those moments when families are trying to push our buttons. That can be, we were talking before about these mini relaxations. You can extend that kind of practice, and there are plenty of apps out there. There are guided meditations on the Benson-Henry Institute website, plenty of places where you can do this, to do it, for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It helps lower one's personal temperature and get one ready to be in a better place when some button pushing starts. So, and when button pushing does start, we have this great exercise we do called Stop, Breathe, Reflect, and Choose, which is, instead of reacting right away, instead of leaping out when that button gets pushed, you just pause for a moment. Maybe you take a mindful breath or two, something like that. That's the breathe part. So you stop, you breathe, and then that gives you the space, and it may be just in a moment in your head, that sort of thing, but it gives you the space to kind of think about how you want to proceed. Maybe you don't want to say a harsh word to the teenager who has not put their dishes in the dishwasher or something like that, and instead want to just give a calm reminder of how that's a family norm, that sort of thing. And in this way, using that kind of thing lowers, and if you can get the whole family to do that kind of stuff, if you get the whole family to meditate together or use those kinds of practices together, you kind of just lower the temperature. And so at Thanksgiving, starting off with whatever's appropriate for your family, a moment of silence, prayer, a meditation, that can be a great way to get the family dinner off to a good start.
Great, thank you. Colleen, the next one's for you, and actually starts off, first of all, Dr. Snydeman, thanks so much for all you're doing for your nursing colleagues. I know for a fact that the MGH nurses are the best nurses on the planet. Having said that, are there lessons learned from the pandemic about ways to maintain morale among the nursing staff, especially as we continue to face these challenges in the future?
Well, thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more about my colleagues at Mass General, nurses and others, all our colleagues. Well, one of the things that we implemented in the last year and a half is called the Circle Up Huddle. And all our inpatient areas are having Circle Up huddles a couple of times a day. The research and the publication was in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Catalyst edition, and the research was done here at MGH by a number of anesthesiologists. And what's unique about Circle Up huddles is that the huddle begins with the stress recognition of our staff. It asks the question of staff, how are you all doing? Does anyone have anything that they would like to bring up that's making them stressed or anticipating that you might have a stressful day? And so every unit is doing that in a little bit of a customized way, but it's working. And the staff, in part of those focus groups we had, and some of the lessons learned earlier, were asking us for routine standardized huddles across the board. And so it was just a terrific combination of implementing what they were asking for, and at the same time, finding serendipitously this type of huddle that included stress recognition. And so we're doing that at each huddle. So that's one example.
Okay. Well, thank you. So Ron, again, this one starts out that I can't thank you enough for what you and Mass General are doing to both take care of and thank our veterans for their service. Are there any new approaches to stress management that are particularly promising or effective for veterans or active duty service members?
Sure. Well, thank you for that comment. As a civilian doctor, I've learned so much from the military culture the last 5 years being involved with home base. It's an amazing group of people. And what's interesting is that, with Dr. Denninger on the line here. You know, there's so much at Benson-Henry that we've connected with over the years as far as stress management and resilience, which is the SMART program. And so, you know, we've adapted over the last few years a program called Resilient Warrior. That's basically the principles that have been studied for years at Benson-Henry and adapt to the cohort of the military population and the family. The other thing we're working on now is actually for kids. In a resilient youth military program specific to a lot of the kids going through some of these changes and stress. You know, I don't have to tell you that a couple months ago with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there's a whole new element of stress that takes on at home and at work because of being there for 20 years and there's a whole not a political conversation. It's more how do we take care of the veterans and military that have come back and are still there. The other I alluded to before, we did a study a couple of years ago, a pilot study with songwriting, and we were able to partner with the Nashville Songwriting with Soldiers group, who were able to do one-on-one writing of an individual song with a veteran, and after 2 hours of a visit with a songwriter that's trained in trauma and post-traumatic stress, they're able to get the lyrics or the emotions out of the person, out of the veteran, and bring it into the lyric and meld it with a beautiful song because they're pro writers. And so we studied it and actually showed a very significant decrease in depression symptoms as well as stress. And so that's one of the unique things we're working on that as we develop wellness in addition to more of the arts. So.
John, this comes in from one of our audience members. Is there a way to access Benson-Henry and take advantage of articles, or do you have to have a referral from a doctor? So. Oh,
that's a good question. I mean, people can definitely, everyone is welcome at the Benson-Henry Institute. And you don't, you can certainly call the Benson-Henry Institute if you're interested in doing the SMART program, for example, and getting resources there. Typically for people who end up in the SMART program, we do ask for, and sometimes it's needed for insurance purposes, for a referral from your primary care doctor or something, but that's pretty standard matter of course kind of stuff. And we're always happy to talk to people who are interested about the work, the research work we're doing, about the clinical work we're doing. And on our website, there are some resources in terms of journal articles and the like. And there's also, we just finished our big continuing medical education course, which has tons of speakers every year that are recorded, and some really great talks, both on the more science side, but also on the more kind of layperson friendly kind of talking about this kind of work.
And so, John, we have time for one more question, and this one just came in, and John, I'm going to go back to you for this one as well. Have you seen professions of religious faith as a protectant against stress and building resilience?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, one of the things that Herb Benson showed in his work early on, and that has sort of been a theme with the Benson-Henry Institute throughout, is it's probably less important what the specific kind of practice you do, as opposed to doing some kind of practice, some kind of mind-body practice. And prayer and religious faith is certainly one of those things that can have dramatic effects on brain and body in terms of physical and mental health in the long term, not to mention probably being good for society as well. And that's an important thing that I think fits well with all the kind of work that we do at the Benson-Henry Institute.
Well, we've reached 1:45. I'd like to thank all of our panelists again for just a terrific session. And I'd like to thank the audience for, these incredibly thoughtful, questions that you submitted. And unfortunately, once again, we didn't get to them all. But any additional questions that you'd like to submit, you can submit them to mghevents@partners.org, and we'll circulate those amongst the panel members, and we'll get answers back to you. So once again, thanks very much for joining us and for attending and your participation. And as always, please be safe out there. Bye-bye.